All right, 10:05. Let's get things going this morning here. Appreciate everybody taking the time and joining us for this. Let's get into presenter view real quick. Okay, so yeah, thanks again for taking the time and joining us today. We're going to talk ASR and some of its high-level functions and structure today. Hoping by the end of this demo, you'll have a good high-level understanding of some of the technologies used in Azure Site Recovery, how they can assist your organization with the beginning steps of your cloud journey, DR planning, and some application sandboxing and testing along the way to
Unknown participant is now joining.
make sure those applications are ready for moving into the cloud. So who are we? We're Model Technology Solutions. We were founded in 2014 by IT engineers. That's our heads are firmly in the clouds, and we have a project delivery team to help move, discover, and create plans for you guys to move objects into Azure or other Microsoft technologies as well as SCCM. We have an as a service extension through our managed services team that work with your IT team. And we're very cloud embracing. We love to help you determine what workloads are a fit, how to move them, how to test them, and how to transition them. Really trying to make that journey to the cloud as easy for you guys as possible. And our mission to empower our partners through services, automation, and optimization to all become some infrastructure heroes together. Who am I? I'm Nick Taylor. I'm a senior consultant here at Model Technology. Been here for a little bit over 3 years. I enjoy nerd things. I love the cloud. I love virtualization. Love automation. I think the reason I love the cloud so much is it reminds me of the early days of virtualization. It's just another paradigm shift in how we're managing and delivering services to end users and organizations. And we're still in its infancy. It's really exciting time to be a part of IT. And automation. I'm a lazy admin like tons of other engineers. If we click on something more than two times, let's script it and find a way to repeat it so we don't have to click those GUI options anymore. I absolutely love IT. Been doing it for the better part of 2 decades. It's just a great time. I love this field. And again, I absolutely love the early stages of the cloud that we're in right now. So, as an overview to today and the rest of our 3 sessions inside of our ASR introductory series, part one today is going to cover high level fundamentals of ASR and an introduction to some of the technologies and some of the benefits we can get out of it. Part two that we're doing next week is going to show some additional functionality and configuration. And part three is going to be some advanced concepts, adding in things like scripting, third party tools, some other interesting and advanced concepts we've deployed out in the field that helps bring all of this data into ASR and move your data centers into Azure. So, the agenda for today, what is ASR? ASR is Disaster Recovery as a Service. We're going to discuss how it's a service for Hyper-V and VMware. We're going to discover how it can be a lift and shift mechanism for VMs to Azure. The same tool that we use to provide disaster recovery, we could use those tools to migrate those VMs into Azure and give us a great test path to do so and a good comfort level moving those services when we do. We're also going to, at a high level, discuss Azure Migrate and some of the differences between itself and Azure Site Recovery. We're going to take a look at recovery vaults, find out what a recovery vault is, what's inside a recovery vault, and we're going to take a look at Azure Backup as it also appears inside of the recovery vault. Talk to that as a high level and understand that technology a little bit. And then as all along the way, we're going to be finding out the additional benefits of using ASR to get DR in your environment, some of the benefits just around DR, and the abilities to test and run your workloads from your environment against Azure Fabrics. Having the ability to test and sandbox off those environments as well. And every time we test an application, we also test DR. So, disaster recovery as a service. Let's take a look at some common challenges with disaster recovery and how ASR can help remediate those. So, when I was internal IT, one of my primary challenges with managing our disaster recovery sites was it's a completely separate data center to manage care and feed. So, everything we put into our primary data center, we're having to replicate at our disaster recovery site. So, we have to constantly keep that scaled to production levels. If I buy a new storage area network and I throw it in my production site because I'm IO constrained for certain new applications that started up in my data center, I have to create all of those same items over in my disaster recovery center. So I have the same level of functionality once I fail those objects over if a disaster ever happens. I have to refresh all those items at the same rate, SANs, hosts, servers, all these objects I pretty much have to copy and paste into my DR environment so I know I'm at those same levels. Then I have to get into patching for those objects. So not only do I have to patch hosts, storage, network fabrics, all these items in my primary data center that are time consuming and create outage windows, I have to do them all over again at my disaster recovery site. And if this is a manual process, then I'm doing patch parties over the weekend, creating all these scripts. It's just a lot more work. It takes a lot of time to keep that disaster recovery site as up to date as your primary site. And add in, you possibly have other test and dev environments on top of DR as well. So maybe you've got test dev environments that float around for developers and users for acceptance. All of these things are possibly outside of your DR environment. So not only am I managing my primary data center, I'm managing my DR data center, and I'm managing these smaller test dev environments that are possibly running on legacy hardware, but they're treated as production since my developers need to touch them and my users need to touch them for user acceptance along the way. So how can ASR help with this? Well, hopefully it's going to take these additional 2 full-time jobs of managing these additional data centers and give you that time back. So what are we going to do? We're just going to manage our primary data center like we traditionally do, and then add in the replication of these VMs into a separate data center that Microsoft's going to manage for us. It's going to give us time back as engineers to focus on things that are important to our business. We're going to let Microsoft manage some of these vanilla workloads for us, like fabric patching and maintenance to your DR site. So let's take host maintenance out of the mix. Let's take network maintenance out of the mix. We don't have to worry about those security appliances that are in our DR center. Microsoft's doing the heavy lifting over there. Let's focus on what's important on-prem inside your walls, and the possibility that ASR can eliminate the need for those additional test dev environments. So no more rolling that even older hardware down for developers or having a completely separate instance to manage and recover. We can have something to sandbox off our applications and do a great job for testing. And an additional cool item, if your C-level's on you for are you cloud ready, you can honestly answer yes. Use ASR to get your DR environment into the cloud. Use its sandboxing features to actually test all of your applications, all of your workloads in the cloud. Make sure they work as expected and have that user acceptance. Let those C-levels know that, hey, we're close to be able to moving this tier 1 application, but these tier 3 applications are a much better fit. You can start developing that roadmap and having those conversations. So let's dive into some of the ASR terminologies, talk about some acronyms and stuff. So some of the key scenarios, disaster recovery, site-to-site replication. This is what ASR is going to take care of for us as one of its primary features. We're moving from your fabric on-prem into an Azure data center. It's also going to be a lift and shift mechanism to Azure. So if we're happy with DR, we're happy with these test failovers, we're going to be able to take these applications and services that we're carving out as part of our process for disaster recovery, and within a few more clicks, lift and shift them into Azure, run against that fabric. If it's a good fit for that workload, we don't have to bring it back on-prem. We can bring it into a different Azure data center or bring it into a network that we've already configured that connects back to on-prem in a hybrid mode. We also have ASR and Azure Migrate. Again, we'll touch on Azure Migrate at a very high level. ASR is a much easier way to get that foothold, in my opinion, as it supports more automation, more testing, ease of failback. But if you know you're moving to the cloud and those decisions have already been made, Azure Migrate's a great tool to get you up in there as well. And application sandboxing and testing. I think it's one of my favorite features of ASR and the ancillary benefits. Not only do you have solid disaster recovery that you don't have to care and feed constantly from a patching and fabric perspective, you've got a way to take your applications, your in-house applications, your set copies of Active Directory, your live sets of data, fail those over within 30 minutes into a sandbox inside of Azure, and run things like upgrade scripts. Actually look at your tier one application, your ERP system, the applications that are most critical for your business, put them inside of ASR in a sandbox, run your scripting of your upgrade testing against them, take those exact scripts that you would have to run in your live environment and bring them into your change board. Not only is that going to help with change approval in that process, you're going to have a much higher comfort level of performing those upgrades in your live environment and not having to build one-off systems for these application testings. And while we're doing that, we're testing DR at the same time. So let's take a look at some of ASR's key concepts here. So a recovery vault. What's a recovery vault? It's the logical object where we're storing all of our replicated data and our configuration data around all of that. So it's also going to provide Azure Backup in addition to Azure Site Recovery, and we'll touch on Azure Backup at a high level as well. From an on-prem infrastructure side, we're going to look at how we can deploy clients to our Hyper-V hosts, which if you're a Hyper-V environment, this is one of our only prerequisites for beginning to replicate VMs into Azure using Azure Site Recovery. I just wanted to touch on that there are clients for VMware virtual machines. You will need an agent on all virtual machines currently. And for physical machines, if you're planning on replicating any physical machines into ASR. We will also need a replication server for VMware virtual machines or physical machines. So a little bit more infrastructure build out required for VMware on the physical machine side, not so much on the Hyper-V side. And we're going to take a look at recovery plans. What is a recovery plan? How do we set up the recovery plan? What does it do? A recovery plan is just a logical object for grouping of services. So it gives us an option of bringing up tiers. We can bring up our database tiers, our middle tier servers, our web servers in front of that, stage those out logically and with custom scripts built into the recovery plan as well if we need to act against Azure Fabric or on-premise Fabric and make things like internal DNS changes or update connection strings since we're moving fabrics over, anything like that, all those items such as that. And replication policies. How are we going to set these virtual machines from our sites and hosts to replicate up into Azure? What are the frequencies these copies are going to happen? Are we worried about app consistent policies so we quiesce logs and set machines up for failover when they begin over in Azure? And we're going to look at the recovery vaults as a single pane of glass to look at health and management of these items and infrastructure from a very high level. And Azure Automation. This is going to be our tie-in for automation with built-in connectivity right into Azure Site Recovery. So if we need, which most organizations do, we need custom scripts along with just starting our virtual machines. We'll need to start certain services. We'll need to check certain things. Maybe we need to add in some IIS bindings because we're moving fabrics behind the scenes. Maybe we need to build out a custom script to run against Azure. Maybe we need to stop a virtual machine in Azure because we're bringing another one up or set static IPs against it. Any custom actions we need to bolt against the Azure Fabric, we can create an Azure Automation, put a step inside of our recovery plan, and fire that script. Additionally, if we need to run scripts against our on-premise or currently on-premise infrastructure, objects that we own and manage internally as a company, we could deploy items such as hybrid runbook workers to give us those hooks inside of our infrastructure machines and update things like internal DNS. Maybe we want to fail over a SQL Server availability group member into Azure. Anything on our machines outside of Azure Fabric, we can still work with in Azure Automation inside of our recovery plan to orchestrate that one-click failover to bring us from on-prem into the cloud or to sandbox off that application. And I wanted to touch on Azure Backup since we'll see some of these components inside of our recovery vault. So what is Azure Backup versus ASR? Azure Backup is a traditional point-in-time recovery backup and restore solution. We're going to be able to recover data from weeks and months ago. When we look at ASR, Azure Site Recovery is designed for disaster recovery. Our retention window for the snapshots that we're bringing up into Azure is around 24 hours or less, depending on how we set up these policies. So not saying ASR isn't a great tool to keep in your back pocket to still recover something from a virtual machine or your infrastructure, but it is not designed for long-term recovery and retention policies around your data. So it shouldn't replace any traditional point-in-time backup and restore solution. With Azure Backup, we can take full point-in-time snapshots of servers, databases, and file share and granularly recover those. Set retention policies around those if we wanted those windows well beyond that 24-hour window that ASR provides us on the DR side of the house. So Azure Site Recovery versus Azure Migrate. Just wanted a high-level touch on this to know there's another tool out there. Azure Migrate provides a dashboard for replication, testing, and migration. It doesn't have a concept of these recovery plans for bringing up resources or tiers in certain orders or injecting custom PowerShell to make things happen, checks on virtual machines, failing anything over. We can put all of our VMs inside of our Azure Migrate pane, check their resource utilization on-prem, look at how they should be sized in Azure, do a test failover so we still virtualize them, make sure this one-off machine comes up healthy, but we can't bring it up in certain tiers to know that your application is going to come up. It's a great option to have, but in my humble opinion, ASR is a much better foothold to begin your Azure journey and create these recovery plans and understand how you're going to move these fabrics around. Another note would be for Azure Migrate, there's no agents required for VMware on your virtual machines, which is great. I'm really hoping they streamline that ability into ASR one of these days. Another thing to note is there are really no failback options post-migration with Azure Migrate. We'll show you some of the failback options and seamless options to move your workloads back from Azure to on-prem using ASR here in a few slides. And again, limited testing compared to recovery plans. We're really just bringing one machine up inside of Azure, testing it to make sure it's stable, running a few metrics, and then we have to finalize that cutover. So let's take a look at some Azure migration phases with Azure Site Recovery. Kind of some proof of concept, testing, lift and shift methodologies of starting on-premise, getting us into a hybrid mode, finally cutting over those workloads, possibly living totally in the cloud, and how we would handle disaster recovery at that point in time once we're living straight inside of a Microsoft data center in Azure. So you're nervous about taking that first workload into the cloud? I mean, we all were. I mean, it really reminds me of the virtualization days and that first weekend migration where we moved our first production SQL server or Exchange server virtualized. We did as much testing as we could. We were very confident, but those first couple days were still nerve-wracking, and they should be. It's very new technology. It's great. We get a lot more power through it, but it's intimidating at times. How does Azure Site Recovery help us dip that toe in the cloud and be less nervous about moving those workloads? Test failovers. They're fantastic. We get to replicate all of our VMs, set them up in tiers to stand up our database, middle tier security appliances, whatever we need, parallel to our production environment with no outage required, and test those apps. We can get engineers in there via RDP sessions. We could run traditional perfmon tools. We could run those workloads with very little configuration inside of a data center and know how they're going to perform in a multi-tier scenario. We can get in there, we could test, benchmark, tear it all down, tweak our settings, stand it all back up, benchmark it again, and do all of this while production is unaffected. Once as an IT engineer or administrator, once we do this several times, we can get users in there, get them into that sandbox, get some friends of IT, let them beat it around a little bit. If we have a month-end billing process, we can have them run it in our live environment, benchmark that time for that process, and let them jump straight into the same environment that we just copied with the same data with no need to update or refresh that data, and let them do that all again in Azure. Benchmark those times. Did it take longer? Was it a quicker process? Looking at performance data, do we need to increase our disk speed in Azure? Maybe make a big beefier VM? Take all of that knowledge, roll it into version 2 of this, get our proof of concept testing done. So after that, we get some proof of concept stuff. Let's go hybrid. So if you're not already set up to Azure with a site-to-site or a site-to-site VPN or express route, set it up during this process. Get your data center tiered up to support workloads in Azure. Then we could perform a planned failover from one of our on-premise VMs to Azure. Hopefully, pick a low tier, pick something maybe IT facing only, a ticketing system, some file shares for IT, move it up there, keep it live for a few days. Once those management servers are burned in, you're happy with the results, the IT team members can't see a difference living in a hybrid environment, go ahead and commit the migration, finalize that failover. Once we click finalize the failover, that workload is removed on premise and it's now living in Azure full time. So we just cleaned up disk resources, compute resources from on-prem, lifted that to Azure, living in a true hybrid world. If the migration isn't going well, we can seamlessly move it back to on-premise before finalizing the migration. Look at what we did wrong, plan for round 2, and do it all over again. Going hybrid also opens you up for several other cool options, like taking a SQL availability group member, letting a portion of it live in IaaS, and then later on this journey, adding in things like Azure Automation to fail over that availability group member and get your SQL data running live in an IaaS function inside of Azure as well. So once we've done proof of concept, some low tier workloads, great, let's kick more high services to the cloud. We can just start lifting and shifting at this point in time. We've got it in ASR, we move it up. We keep moving these services up. We're evacuating our current data center. We're happy with the performance in Azure. We understand the components around it. We keep moving forward. If failback isn't required and we see a whole nother set of VMs that we're happy with at this point, we could use Azure Migrate in conjunction with ASR if it's not part of a disaster recovery or multi-tiered approach. Just tell it to lift and shift that VM up into Azure. Once they're there and we need a more traditional point-in-time recovery solution, we could buy a product out of the marketplace, or we could leverage Azure Backup to get those traditional point-in-time recovery options outside of ASR. So we could still granularly recover options for users' file share, SQL Server databases from 2 weeks ago, all those things that ASR isn't. So the last step, once you'd move that data center up into Azure, let's use ASR one more time. So what you probably want to do is set up DR again. Once you're pinned to a single Azure data center, let's say Azure East 2, and you want to insulate yourself from an Azure East 2 failover, we could set up ASR to move your VMs and replicate them over to West. We'd still get all those options like sandboxing, available in Azure West. And we use the same discovery data we found to migrate our additional data from on-prem into Azure. We just slightly adjust those recovery plans. So it's not like we lost any of that work during discovery. We're going to tweak those recovery plans. And instead of saying go from on-prem to East 2, we're going to say go from East 2 over to West. All of our services will come up on another new network connections, and we've just survived an Azure outage. And again, we still get the sandboxing into a different region. So we could still do all that testing, have all that data for change management, have all that comfort level of upgrading Active Directory schema, knowing you don't brick an in-house application. We still get all that through sandboxing in that different Azure region. So, okay, so that's enough PowerPoint. Figure we'll jump into some Azure tenants here and take a look around at some of these things from a high level. Let me get out of presenter view here. and flip on over to my test Azure tenant. Okay, so here's my test Azure tenant, and here is the home screen of ASR, which will just give me a single pane of glass into my site recovery objects, my backup objects, a quick overview of new features, how to set up that infrastructure. Let's start walking through here. So from the overview screen, I can see that I've got a grand total of 1 replicated item. It's healthy, and we'll take a look at that here in a second. And I've got a failover test that it's recommending I perform, as I haven't performed a failover test on the 1 VM I'm transporting. I've got no configuration errors, and I've configured 1 recovery plan for giggles. So let's look at how we would set this up. I'm going to jump you into Site Recovery Infrastructure. And in Site Recovery Infrastructure, it's my starting point for getting all these items set up. I can take Azure to Azure virtual machines, set up all my configuration items for that. I could set up VMware and physical machines. If I'm a System Center house and use software-defined networking, I can set up my System Center configuration manager portions in there, or I'm sorry, System Center virtual machine manager configurations in there. And what we're going to focus on today is our Hyper-V sites. So if you're a Hyper-V shop, I'm going to walk you through some steps that would get you to replicating VMs in roughly 30 minutes. So let's take a look from the top down. When I look at a Hyper-V site, I can carve any of these logical groupings of hosts together. So I have a couple data centers made here right now. So I've got my on-premise data center with 1 host protecting 1 VM, and then I've just created a couple other data centers. Fairly easy to do. Click new Hyper-V site, give the data center a name. It's going to create that in the back end. We'll see it. There we go. We'll see a data center pop up right there. That's really all that's to this step. Logically define your data centers, create them, and we move on to our host portion. So now those hosts that live in our data center, I've got my 1 host set up here. It's connected, last heartbeat time, good latest agent version. It's a Hyper-V server, and it tells me what site it's bound to. If I wanted to add a brand new server into any of these sites, I click on plus server. If this is a Hyper-V machine, I'm taking a Hyper-V server. It might take 15 to 30 minutes to actually get that Hyper-V server in the vault, but it's a fairly quick process. What do I need to do? Just make sure it's running server 2012 R2 or above and make sure I'm at current patch levels. If I need to configure proxy settings for my data center, I might need to mess with that a little bit. I am not, and I'm going straight out to the internet. Once I'm there, all I'm doing is downloading the installer for ASR recovery and installing that on my host. Once I download those bits, I'm going to click next about 3 times or deploy it via SCCM in some automated fashion. And then I'm going to bind that host to one of my data centers. Now I download this recovery file and I insert it in the last screen of my installer. And that is going to take my host and bind it over to my Hyper-V site right there. So now I've provisioned a data center. I provision a single host or hundreds of hosts in this screen, deployed them out. I'm going to set a replication policy. I've got a default replication policy here. I'm just going to take a look at it and show you some of the options. Here's where I associate it with a Hyper-V site, so I could have different replication policies and only bind those replication policies to those different Hyper-V sites if I have any use to segment them off. If I look at my replication policy, the options are pretty thin here. Where's my source, Hyper-V? Where's my target, Azure? What's my copy frequency? I could have 5 minutes or 30 seconds. This is happening at a block level. This is the agent on your host transporting blocks up into Azure. So every 30 seconds or 5 minutes. How long do I want to keep those recovery points? I can go from 0 to 24 hours. So if I want every 5-minute copy for my VMs lasting for 24 hours, I would set that up between these 2 fields. When do I want to take an app consistent snapshot? So this is going to leverage VSS inside of a virtual machine, quiesce your logs, get it in an app consistent state, and then take that snapshot, move it to Azure as well. And when do I want to start this replication time? I could do it immediately. If I want to lift and shift, or if I want to replicate 50 VMs, and I know that's going to increase IO on my SAN and network throughput, I could set them to start sometime off hours that would be a little bit more tolerable for the business. And I could also set up encryption going into Azure itself. So from a high level, those are the three pieces you need to start moving virtual machines if you're a Hyper-V site into Azure. It's fairly quick and painless. There's a lot of planning that needs to go around the end portions once the machines are there, but to start replicating, it's 15 to 30 minutes. It's really impressive. They've done a good job streamlining the onboarding for this. So now that we have talked through the site's host and replication policies, let's take a look at actual replicated items. So on my replicated items tab, I'm only bringing one demo server at this point in time. I could see that my demo server is healthy and protected, and I could look at my options inside of my demo server. At this point in time, since it's up in Azure, it's healthy and protected, I have some options for failover. We'll have these similar options inside of recovery plans when we look at them here in a second as well. So on this virtual machine, I could do a planned failover, which means I'm DR testing. When I do a planned failover, it is going to stop my on-premise VM. It is going to start my VM inside of Azure, bind up any custom objects you have in there, drop it in the current VNets, follow those replication policies for bringing it online, and then I could let it run for an hour, a day, 3 days, test it inside of Azure. If I'm happy with it and I want it to live in Azure, I could do a commit. If I'm not happy, I can clean up and move back on-prem. If I'm actually in a disaster scenario where my on-premise data center is gone, I could do a hard failover. I take the last recovery point I have, either app consistent or block level, and just fail it over and boot to Azure. My primary data center is gone, get things running over wherever the heck it needs to be running at. And then the last option, my favorite, is a test failover. So I could use this test failover option on a VM, and I'll dive into actually doing these test failovers and showing you how to access these environments in session 2. But at this point in time, I could tell it I'm going to go from on-prem to Azure, pick my recovery point, and then I'm going to select an isolated virtual network. When I select an isolated virtual network, it's going to bring this single machine, since we're looking at one single box here, up into that isolated network. I could access that network and see how that machine is performing against Azure Fabric. It gets a little neater when we look at recovery points because we could add in the custom automation with that as well. But from a per VM level, that's what I wanted to show you off here. You still have all these options. So let's take a look at adding an item. So if I wanted to add a new item from my hosts, I jump in here, I tell it where it's coming from. If I'm migrating, I tell it my source location, so I get to pick from my Hyper-V sites if I bind them in here, where there's VMs running. I only have one additional VM running in my traditional data center. Hit OK. I get to pick failover options for my VM when it goes live in Azure. What subscription do I want this bound to? What resource group do I want this VM to live in once it fails over? What deployment model do I want it to use, Resource Manager or Classic? I would always recommend Resource Manager. What storage account I want it bound to. So when this VM lives in Azure, do I want it on standard disk? Do I want it on SSD? I can configure multiple storage accounts over here. And in an actual failover event, what network do I want this falling over to? So I want it to go right into my server subnet, boot, and become live. So pick those few options, hit OK. Now I get to select virtual machines. I only have one other VM spinning on my demo cluster right now, so I would select that VM. If I have hundreds, I could filter my items. If I have a list, I could use PowerShell to pump all this up and create these initial replication objects. I'm going to click OK here and configure the properties per VM. So it wants to know what operating system this runs, Windows. Wants to know what the OS disk is. I only have one disk on this right now, so it's going to be a fairly simple choice. And then if I have multiple disks, I could pick and choose if I want to exclude one of them for replication. So say I have a traditional SQL server, or say I have a backup volume on that SQL server, say I'm moving to Azure Backup and I don't feel like moving a few more terabytes up into Azure because I'm going to recreate my backup set inside of Azure, I wouldn't have to bring that backup disk. Click OK there. And then I pick my replication policy. Now, I've only got one default, one bound right now, so it's going to copy every 5 minutes, keep it for 2 hours, get an app consistent snap every hour, begin it immediately, and not store in Azure. I'll just click OK here. And it'll start the replication, enable replication. And it'll start getting this VM ready for replication on the back end here. So the last object I wanted to touch inside here today was, my recovery plans. So here's the recovery plans. I've got a test one set up here, but let's just go ahead and create a new one and I'll give you some options. So I can create this recovery plan. So I could say 2-tier service to Azure. So these could be total recovery plans, one click for your entire environment. If you're looking to sandbox, I usually create a recovery plan and try to modularize it. So I bring up Active Directory, I bring up SQL servers, middle tier servers, web servers, and then any security appliances. Bring it up just like you would in your traditional data center. You're going to have dependencies in your applications on other tiers. So I break these out and try to make them modular, and then in a larger recovery plan, bolt them all together. And I'll be showing examples of that in session 2 and 3. So give it a name, select my source. I'm coming from on-premise. My target is Azure, and I'm going to deploy this with Resource Manager, so I have some PowerShell options. And what VMs can I take? Hey, here's both my servers. So I've got my IIS server and my SQL server. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to hit OK. And it's going to create this recovery plan. Inside of this recovery plan, we're going to see multiple groups and where we can inject some custom code. As soon as it spins up, go Azure. Hey, there it is. So inside my recovery plan, I get my test failover options. More, I actually get plan failover and failover options. So as I group these scripts together and all these custom actions to move you out of your data center into Azure, I could fire a recovery plan just like I can a single VM. I'm going to customize this real quick and kind of show you the recovery plan. So I have one group at this point in time. I'm going to fail over 2 machines. Those are my 2 machines. I get group 1 start. All this can be done via PowerShell and importing these objects via JSON as well. But let's pretend I'm doing a 2-tier service here, which I am. I'm going to add a group. And I can take my IIS server, which would have a dependency. I'm going to delete it out of that group. And I'm
Unknown
put it
participant is now exiting.
and I could put that in group 2 and have a 2-tier app set up. And in any portions through any of this, I can add in objects for my scripts. So I could say add a post action, set public IP, select my automation account, and I could see all my runbooks that have been created in my Azure automation account to do custom code against any of these objects. Hit OK, and I could save my plan. And that's a real basic 2-tier recovery plan. And again, we'll get deeper into recovery plans and their actual automation in the other sessions. So from a high level, hopefully we have a good understanding of how to get VMs into Azure, what a recovery vault is, how to add in a logical site, how to add in your hosts into that logical site, how to transport those VMs, and a quick idea of what recovery plans are and how I would use those to fail those over in a test or a live function into Azure. Jump back into the slide deck here. And totally open it up for questions. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to fire them in the chat window and we can discuss and I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. Just give everybody a couple minutes to fire anything they want in the chat window. And if nobody has any questions, we'll move past. Give a couple minutes here. Everything's pretty quiet so far. I'll give everybody like 2 minutes, and then if no questions, I'll just move on to the wrap-up section. Okay, cool. I don't think anybody has any questions today, which is totally cool. Let's jump on to the next slide here. And if you do come up with something as we're closing up, feel free to yell it out or feel free to contact me afterward. I'll have my email at the end of this slide here. So there's email if you need it, just nick.taylor@model-technology.com. So if you do think of anything outside of this presentation once you leave, drop me a line and I will try to answer it to the best of my ability. I thank you so much for spending an hour with me and starting to look at Azure Site Recovery. I hope you'll join us for session 2 and session 3. A week from now is session 2. A week from then is session 3. Next scheduled info, I'm going to take a look at some of those test failovers, looking at your live environment, actually running a recovery plan versus 2-tier, talking about some user access into those environments, setting up a couple network security groups that would always fire with your recovery plans so you know it's isolated, nobody else could be RDPing into your servers, touch on Azure Bastion service and how you could use that to get inside virtual machines if that's your preferred route. And then session 3, we're going to dump on some additional scripting and some third-party options that we've used to migrate data into Azure as well. So hopefully you'll join us. Hopefully this was informative. Thank you so much for spending part of your morning with me, and I hope to see you next week. Take care and goodbye.